Hi everyone, this is Dr. McClellan. This will be your last lecture of the 2018 fall semester, and this will focus on Athenaze Chapter 12, which will introduce us to the first aorist, or as some people like to call it, the weak aorist. We'll talk a little bit more about what those terms generally mean. It should be pretty fairly obvious when you look at the forms, but this is all that we need to focus on for this chapter. So for Chapter 12, we'll be looking at the first aorist in the indicative forms, how to say I, you, he, she, it, we, all, they did something in the past. We'll look at how to form participles with this new type of aorist, infinitives, and imperatives. So this will be a relatively condensed chapter and lecture, and this will nicely round out our semester for everything that you need to have for the final exam coming up in a couple weeks. So before we get into some of the details, a bird's eye view of where Greek verbs are coming from. Remember, there's 5 pieces of information that you always need to know about any Greek verb that you're looking at and that can help you translate it. The first and most obvious 2, person and number, first, second, and third, singular and plural, just like the chart you see on the right. Tense, talking about when an action occurs, we've looked at that before. Mood describes the degree to which an action is real. And voice, whether it's active or middle, and eventually we will learn passive forms in Greek. So those are the 5 pieces of information to remember: person, number, tense, mood, and voice. The other way you can really understand tenses in Greek, as I've talked about before, is to understand them as falling on 2 spectrums. One is time. Tenses in Greek fall, generally speaking, into the past, present, and future, which you can see in the columns on the top of this table. But Greek tenses also fall into different aspects, which you can see on the rows on the left side of this table. The simple aspect covers any simple action like I taught, I teach, or I will teach. Generally speaking, that's what we call the simple aspect of verbs. And you've already learned that the present and future simple aspects are covered by, predictably, the present and future tense in Greek. Those 2 tenses also in Greek cover the continuous aspect, the incomplete aspect of those verbs. So paideo, for example, can not only be translated as I teach, the simple aspect meaning, but I am teaching, I am currently teaching, the continuous aspect of that term. As does the future. Paideoso can be I will teach, generally speaking, or I will be teaching, I will continue to teach. So it's really important to understand the distinction between time and aspect, because when it comes to the aorist, the box you can see in the top left of this chart, the aorist form epaidosa, from paideo, only covers the past time in simple aspect. Epaidosa never means I was teaching, it only ever means I taught, simply speaking. So in other words, the aorist tense is basically like our concept of a simple past tense of a verb. I walked, I was hit, and so forth. Another way I like to think of it, and I find this to be a really helpful metaphor when using different verb tenses in Greek, is to think of an aorist like looking at a photograph. So-and-so did something. Maybe so-and-so fed the crocodile. Whereas eventually we'll learn that the imperfect tense is kind of like watching a film happening because it covers the continuous aspect in the past time. So-and-so is feeding the crocodile when suddenly it snapped in the aorist. So that should hopefully get us up to speed on where the aorist fits into all of this with Greek verbs, and we've already learned how to form them in one way, the so-called second aorist, or some people call it the strong or thematic aorist, which, as you saw, involves changing the verb stem entirely and is a little bit less common than the first aorist, which is slightly more common, and we'll talk about this over the next 2 chapters going into next semester, but today we'll just be focusing on what we have for chapter 12 for this form. So the first aorist is actually pretty simple to recognize. It's one of the easiest things to recognize and translate in ancient Greek because it's so distinctive in its sound and its spelling. The first weak aorist is formed by a pretty simple formula. It starts off just like the strong aorist with this temporal augment epsilon to say that it is in past time, followed by an aorist stem, which is basically the present stem of the verb, followed by sigma, and then a new set of endings that we'll call the first aorist endings. You're going to have some new endings that you need to learn for the first aorist that are distinct and different from the second aorist. So, for example, with the verb luo, I loosen, when it goes into the aorist, the form is elusa. Elusa. You can see that on the second bullet point on this slide. You can see all three parts of the formula here. Epsilon is put at the beginning. You can see that in red. That's my temporal augment to tell me it's in past time. I'm still using the same stem lu, but added a sigma to it before adding the first aorist ending a. Alpha is how I say I in the first aorist. So elusa means I loosened. I translated like any other aorist, which is very different from lepo, which is the second aorist, which I know by changing the stem entirely to elipon and elipes. Notice that it's completely different with its sets of endings from the first aorist, which is going to use a unique set by itself. Eventually, we will learn that other tenses use these sets of endings as well, particularly the same ones as the second aorist, namely in the imperfect and pluperfect, but we'll learn about those later on next semester. So you don't need to worry about that for now, but just be aware that some of these will come back. So it's important to learn these endings and spend some time memorizing them. So when we talk about the first or weak aorist, it's basically just a matter of remembering this formula. Epsilon as the augment, plus the aorist stem, you're basically just adding a sigma to the regular present stem, and the first aorist sets of endings, usually starting with a in the active. So luo, like you saw before, starts with an epsilon, add sigma to the end of the stem lu, and then add alpha to the end of that, and you get elusa, I loosened, past time. Simple as that. The tricky thing with adding the sigma is that, as you've already seen in the future tense, when the sigma goes next to a consonant, it can sometimes change that consonant to a new letter in the process. So for example, pempo, when it goes to the aorist, just like when it goes to the future, we'll add the stem pemp, put an epsilon in front of it, epemp. When I add sigma to the end of it, I get psi at the end, because pi and sigma make the sound ps, which is already covered by the letter psi. So epemps is following the same formula as the one you have above before I add the ending a. So epempsa is my aorist form, meaning I sent, and I sent once. Same with grapho, which will also follow this formula by adding epsilon to the beginning, sigma to the end of grap, which gives you graps, and the ending alpha to give you grapsa, I wrote, in past time. Dioko will do a very similar thing when it adds a sigma to the end of its stem. Dioxa is just kappa and sigma making xi. You can see it in red. You've already seen this combination happen before in future tense verbs. So dioxa is I pursued in the first aorist, following the same formula. And this will also happen in the middle voice. So a verb like dekhomai, for example, will become edexamein. Notice that's a different ending than a in the middle voice. There are separate endings for that. Edexamein is I received in the past. Same with patho. When patho, any dental form, runs into sigma, sigma wins. So path plus sigma gives you pace. Epesa means I persuaded in the aorist, and spaudo similarly would become espousa. Sigma beats up delta, and that means I hurried. So basically, the first aorist is pretty simple to recognize because it's going to use the same present tense stems that you already know for most verbs, with just adding typically a sigma at the end of them before all of the endings that come later. And these are the endings that you need to know for this chapter. So remember, you've already learned to add an epsilon or augment to the beginning. You already saw how to add a sigma to the end of the aorist stem. And then all you need to do afterwards is know these sets of endings. And this is where you're going to need to spend some time memorizing this chart. So the first aorist active endings for verbs that stay in the active voice will be a, as, or sometimes N, sometimes nu gets added at the end of the third singular. Amen, ate, on. I'm going to read through this one more time so you can hear the pattern here. A, as, e, amen, ate, on. One thing that makes the first aorist so easy to recognize is that it always has alpha as the theme vowel in most of its endings. It makes it very distinctive and different from any other tense that you come across. So the first aorist is very, very easy to recognize and translate as long as you know these endings, because it's just so obviously the first aorist, it's not easily confused with anything else that you've seen. So that's the set of endings for the active. Your imperatives in the active voice are on, you can see that below on the left in the singular, and ate in the plural. The infinitive ending is just going to be I, which I'll show you in a little bit, putting it together. Let's look at the middle chart on the right. I'm going to read through the endings once, and then we'll talk about the pattern. Starting with the top left, I is amen, o, ata, ametha, asta, anta. You could probably recognize a lot of these endings as sounding very similar to the second aorist endings with amen, u, eta, ametha, esta, anta. The only key difference here is that I've replaced most of those vowels with alpha. Most of these endings should already be pretty familiar to you. Amen is just replacing alpha for omicron when it goes to the first aorist, amen. The second person singular form, o, the omega, is just a contraction of asa, which was originally the first aorist middle ending, but as you guys already know, when sigma falls in between two vowels, it will drop out, and alpha and omicron contract to omega, which is why your second person singular aorist middle ending is o instead of asa. Ata is kind of close cousin of eta, ametha, asta, anta. Again, the first aorist is really easy to recognize when you're reading because it's going to have those alphas in all those different endings, but this is also important to remember so that you can memorize these endings to know which person and number you're dealing with. The imperatives here are important to remember. In the singular, I will use I, alpha, iota, which can sometimes be confused with the infinitive and the active form, so you have to pay very close attention to context to decide which of the two forms is being used. But in the plural, it's much simpler. It's aste. And the infinitive is pretty familiar, astai instead of estai, which you've seen in the other forms. So what does this look like when it's put together? Well, let's take the example of luo and put it all together. So remember, the augment is only going to be used in the indicative mood when you're saying so-and-so did something. But for imperatives, infinitives, and participles, I never use the epsilon in the aorist tense. So, starting with the active forms on the left side, following the formulas, lusa, that's epsilon at the beginning, luo with the sigma at the end of its stem, and the ending alpha, elusa, I loosened. Second person singular, elusas, you loosened. Third singular, elusen, he, she, or it loosened. Plurals, elusamen, we loosened. Elusate, y'all loosened. And elusan, they loosened. The formula here is pretty simple when you think about it. It's just using epsilon, adding a stem to the end of the verb, and the first aorist endings. And as long as you know how to do that, it's pretty simple. Same with the imperatives. Remember, with the imperatives, you don't use the epsilon, so I will just have looson if I tell one person to loosen in the aorist imperative, or loosate if I tell multiple people to do that. The infinitive form will be loosai, to loosen and to loosen once. So those should be pretty easy once you're able to piece together the endings from the previous slide with the formula that you've got on this one. Let's take a look at the middle endings on the right. Elusamen, very simple formula. Epsilon at the beginning, sigma at the end of lu to give me my aorist stem, and amen for my middle ending. Elusamen will mean I ransomed. That's the middle meaning of luomai. So remember, when I change some verbs to the middle, the meaning of the verb is going to be different. Elusamein, I ransomed, I loosened for my own benefit. Eluso, you ransomed. Elusata, he, she, it ransomed. Plurals. Elusametha, we ransomed. Elusaste, y'all ransomed. And elusanta, they ransomed. Just plug in the right endings, follow the formula, and the first aorist is, by and large, one of the simplest things to work with when it comes to ancient Greek verbs. Quickly through the imperatives, the singular will be lusai. Again, you have to pay attention to context to decide whether it's that versus the infinitive and the active. The plural is lusaste, and the infinitive is lusastai. I don't add epsilons to any of those because they're not indicative. So hopefully that's fairly familiar. If you need to spend some time going back through this part to practice putting these verbs together and copying them on your own, I recommend that you pause the video here and go through those forms again, practicing adding the endings to luo, for example, before you go on to the participles on the next slide. So if you need to pause the video, now is a good time, and I'll meet you after the jump. Okay, so hopefully you had a chance to work your way through the active and middle forms. Now we're going to talk about aorist participles in the first weak aorist. Just like with the active participles in the second aorist, I'm going to follow a 3-1-3 system. And these are actually pretty much analogous to those active and second aorist participles because it's really formed by a simple system. I'll start with the aorist stem in all three columns. I will add ant in blue instead of aunt with omicron, which you've already seen for active and second aorist participles in the active voice elsewhere, plus third declension endings. Remember, this is a 3-1-3 system for the masculine and neuter. In the feminine column, I will use as instead of us. Remember, alphas kind of win out in the first aorist. And then I will use all the third and first declension endings I've already seen before. So we'll start with lusas, having loosened, for the masculine, nominative, singular form. All the forms that you get here are in the singular. Lusas is just a contraction of lus, the aorist stem, with ant, my participle infix, and sigma at the end. And you already know that sigma beats up tau and nu, so alpha just lengthens to compensate for that form. So lusantse becomes lusas, having loosened. Feminine, lusasa. Neuter, lusan. Remember, as, asa, on, just like pas, pas, upon, all, or every. It's going to form very similarly to that adjective. Genitives, lusantos. Feminine, lusases. Neuter, lusantos. Remember, 3-1-3. Datives, lusanti, lusase, first declension. Lusanti, back to third. Accusative, lusanta, lusasan, and lusan. Remember, neuters copy the nominative and the accusative every time. So again, there's no real new thing to follow here. It's all following the 3-1-3 system that you've already learned for adjectives. You just have to remember that you're changing the theme vowels to alphas in those little participle infixes in blue and red. And this carries over to the plurals. Lusantes, if it's masculine nominative plural. Lusasai in the feminine, lusanta in the neuter. I'm using alpha instead. Genitives, lusanton, lusason, or lusanton, 3-1-3. Lusasi in the dative, but that makes sense too because it's just lus with ant and c, what you can see in the parentheses, and you already know that sigma beats up tau and nu, which is going to lengthen the alpha to long alpha, lusasi. Lusasais in the feminine, and lusasi as well for the neuter. And then accusative plurals, lusantas, lusasas, and lusanta. Remember, the neuters are going to copy the nominative and the accusative, and that's all there is to any first or weak aorist participle. That's the active voice. The middle voice is even simpler. Remember, middle participles follow a 2-1-2 system, so they will have second declension endings for the masculine and the neuter instead of third declensions. The formula here, very simple. The aorist stem plus amen, which makes the participle in magenta here, plus your 2-1-2 or first and second declension endings. So let's take a look at the chart here in the singular forms, starting with the nominatives. Lusamenos in the masculine, lusamene feminine, lusamenon neuter. In the genitives, follow those formulas. Lusamenu masculine, lusamenes feminine, lusamenu neuter. Dative, lusameno masculine, lusamene feminine, lusameno neuter. And finally, accusatives, lusamenon masculine, lusamenane feminine, and lusamenon, copying down from the nominative in the neuter gender. All 2-1-2 endings, you already know the endings os, u, o, on, a, ace, a, ain, and on, u, o, on. Just follow the formula at the top, and it couldn't be easier. Same in the plurals. Lusamenoi, lusamenai, lusamena in the nominative. Lusamenon for all of the forms in the genitive, all consistent. Lusamenois, lusamenice, lusamenois in the dative. And finally, lusamenus, lusamenas, lusamena in the accusative plural. And that's all there is to any first or weak aorist participle. Aorist stem plus amen plus the first or second declension endings. Now, for the most part, 90% or more of your first aorists are going to form just like this, adding sigmas to the end of the stems, adding epsilons where you need to, and just throwing in the typical endings with alpha theme vowels for all your changes, except for what we call the asigmatic or without sigmas first aorist verbs. There aren't too many of these, and essentially the rule you want to remember is as follows. For verbs that end in a liquid, that's lambda or rho, or a nasal consonant, typically nu, occasionally mu, the sigma is going to drop out, but you're going to keep the first aorist endings and just lengthen the stem vowel, sorry. So for example, meno, which we already saw had a bizarre future meno, because it does not like to keep the sigma in that either, has the aorist emena. But you can just tell by looking at that third principal part that it's going to follow the first aorist system because its ending is with alpha, not on se. So really the only difference here is that rather than adding sigma before the endings, I just use epsilon, my new aorist stem main, and use alphas, all those alpha endings in the stems. So in the active voice, to say I waited, I'd say emena, emena, I waited. You waited, emenas. He waited, emene, or emenen. We waited, emenamen, again still amen. Y'all waited, emenate, and they waited, emenamen, or emenon, sorry. In the middle voice, same thing. All I'm really doing here is dropping out the sigma from the stem. So emenamen in the middle, emeno, emenata, emenametha, emenasta, and emenanta. All the same endings that you learned from the chart before for the first aorist endings. You just have to know that some verbs will not use the sigma, and it's just a matter of knowing your principal parts and remembering that liquid stems or nasal stems will sometimes follow this rule. All you need to know with first aorists in the asigmatic form is that this is also going to carry over to the infinitives, participles, and imperatives, but you're using all the same endings. So for example, the infinitives are going to be menai and menastai. There's just no sigma in there because it's a liquid stem. Even the imperatives, menon and menai, or in the plurals, menate and menaste, should be pretty easy to identify because you can tell it's aorist because it has alphas in some of the endings. And even though it doesn't have the sigma in there, it's still pretty clear that it's in that past tense. And finally, the participles also follow the same sets of endings. Menas, menasa, menon in the active, and menamenos, menamene main nomenon in the middle. And that is all there is to it when you have to deal with asigmatic aorists in the first system. So make sure to practice with these forms. Your homework on Wednesday is to work through the first reading of the chapter, 12 alpha, and we'll do some practice with forming first aorists in class. So if you need to look back over this PowerPoint to go over the forms, make sure to do so. But fortunately, this is a nice, easy way to finish off our semester together. So thank you guys for being such a fantastic class for these few months, and I'll see you guys on Wednesday. Take care.